What's up guys? Welcome back to another video. So today we're talking nutrition, which is always a hot topic in personal training, but we're going to go with the foundational stuff, understanding like macronutrients and why they're important. Now, even if you're not certified and have the scope of practice to give nutritional advice as a personal trainer, it's still really important to have a good foundational idea of nutrition and nutritional science to a degree. So you can have good conversations with your clients and understand the goals that they want to achieve and how, I guess, to achieve those externally to training in the gym. To have good conversations with a professional network if you don't have that scope of practice, to be able to have good conversations with people that have that main scope of practice as a specialist, dietitian, nutritionist, something like that sits in alignment with how you approach the training and your philosophies and stuff. You want to make sure they go hand in hand so that you might handball those off to those clients whilst you guys get yourself certified or whatever. Like developing a professional network is super important. So, we understand nutrition is a key factor to successful training, and we're going to go into macronutrients today, roles and benefits to consuming certain macronutrients like carbs, proteins, and fats in the diet, and then we'll go on from there in this series talking about energy balance and those kind of things as well. So when we talk about macronutrients, we're talking about nutrients that we need to consume in large quantities. That's what macro means. So macronutrients have three subcategories that obviously comprise of them. They are carbohydrates, protein, and fat. So we're going to go through each individual macro and get a bit of an understanding of like the roles that those macros play just in our body and why we would want to gravitate towards certain ones for just general health and well-being. And obviously more specifically for us, like performance outcomes and maybe some specific goals, whether it be muscle gain, fat loss, lean body mass retention, those kind of things. So first we're going to start with carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are generally the most favored fuel source of the body, and that's because it's just easier to break them down for fuel. When we look at them in terms of their composition and what they're made up of and how they convert to energy, it's just a much more preferred and efficient way to generate fuel and do it quickly. So we got to think like, when are some situations where we need fuel and we need it in large quantities and maybe accessible quite quickly? That's like training and intense activity. So that's where we would want to get more foods that are higher in carbohydrates, like fruits, grains, cereals, sugary goods, those kind of things all will metabolize into smaller units of glucose, which then go through the system and get converted into energy. Now there's three typical types of carbohydrates. So first one being monosaccharides, the next one being oligosaccharides, and the third one being polysaccharides. So what that means is mono means one. It just means that it's a simple form of carbohydrates. They kind of just has like smaller units and it's easier to convert to fuel. So they're the things like, I guess, simple sugars is probably the best way to describe those just in terms of their molecular shape. Then we've got oligosaccharides, which is multiple monosaccharide units bound together. And then polysaccharides is the more complex carbohydrates, which are long chain monosaccharides that are in large quantities kind of bound together, which are going to take a little bit longer to break down. So if we look at these things, we know that there might be times to consume things like simple sugars that get converted to energy quite quickly, like around training. And then there's other times where maybe getting something a little bit more complex in a polysaccharide kind of format, which is like more starchy, more fibrous forms of food, where that can kind of just break down slowly and give us a sustained amount of energy across the day. So that might be in between meals at work and whatnot, or feeding times at work. Like it might be more beneficial for your clients to consume those foods just to kind of keep them satiated for a longer period of time. So that's generally the carbohydrate component of it and like why we would want to use them. Where their main food types are, which we kind of spoke about before, it's like grain, starches, fruits, and some sugary goods. Now, it's important to talk about fiber here because it does fall under the carbohydrate umbrella because fiber is found in more carbohydrate dominant food. Now, there's two types of fiber that we really want to work with. So we've got cellular fiber, which is dissolved in water, form like a gel-like paste, essentially serves to slow down the food through the digestive system, which allows the intestines to extract the nutrients from the food and pass it into the system and allow it to reap the benefits of all of the nutrients in that food inside the system for whatever obligations it needs to fill. So it's a really important component to us absorbing the food that we eat. Now, we've also got in cellular fiber, which like adds bulk to the stool to make sure that we kind of can digest our food well and just pass through like whatever we need and go to the toilet without any complications and stuff. So we need a component of both of those. As a general rule, we like to go with about 30 grams a day to make sure that we're fulfilling those obligations of like fiber in the diet outside of the energy demands and stuff. There's other benefits that fiber does. It balances blood glucose and it can manage cholesterol and stuff by binding excess cholesterol and extracting it from the body. So just depending on the circumstances, it will depend on like how much fiber somebody needs, but generally it's really good for nutrient absorption and it's really, really good for digestion as well. Now we have dietary fats. So dietary fats are really important because they play a really, really vital role in keeping the integrity of our cells, like the cell membrane integrity layer, and also absorbing like fat soluble vitamins. So we got like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. So we need to make sure that we're having a certain amount of fats in the diet to allow our body to absorb those nutrients, maintain the integrity of the cell membrane that we have. So we've got millions and millions of cells. The membrane, which is between the outer layer and the inner layer of that cell, like what happens in between that. The fats that we eat and ingest in the diet can maintain the integrity of those so that we've got things passing in and passing out very, very, very efficiently. Now, when it comes to fats, there's typically three main groups. So we've got saturated fat, we've got monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. So saturated fat's still needed in the diet. It gets a little bit of a bad rap, but it's responsible for creating precursors to sex hormones and things like cholesterol and stuff. So we do need them in the diet. It's just the quantity that we need to be careful of and like the types. So we need to make sure that we're having like less trans fat in the diet, or your clients are having less trans fat in the diet, which is typically, more processed kind of goods. So we want to limit that to as much as possible. And then we've got your saturated fat, which we spoke about before, which typically comes from animal products. So things that involve the fat from meats, butter, like those kind of things, like that's where we typically would get enough of our saturated fat intake from. We wouldn't really have to actively go and seek it. When we talk about polyunsaturated fats, like they're obviously really, really good to ingest to maintain things like omega status. So we've got omega-3s and omega-6s. We also want to consume an amounts of polyunsaturated fats to manage things like LDL cholesterol, which is a really, really important thing to do for longevity and heart health. And then also like managing the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6 to get a little bit more omega-3 in the diet. With typically westernized culture, we have large amounts of omega-6 just with the foods that we have access to, but we need to get a little bit more omega-3, which typically comes in the form of like fatty, fishy kind of types of foods like seafoods and whatnot, which can really help reduce the systemic levels of inflammation, which is really, really good for overall health and well-being, let alone things like putting on muscle size and recovering from training sessions and whatnot. So that's typically where we want to do with our omega-3s and our polyunsaturated fats. Then we've got our monounsaturated fats as well, which really help with managing things like our body cells and managing things like cholesterol as well. And all of these foods are typically found in red meat, oily fish, oils, nuts, and butters, and egg yolks. So it's still important to get a really good composition of fats in the diet. They do get a little bit of a bad rap because they have the same name as something like body fat, but that's just because of how they're molecularly made up. Like they look exactly the same from a molecular standpoint. It's just that they serve different purposes. One's as long-term energy substrate when we've run out of energy supply through the food and diet. That's what body fat is. Dietary fat's different. It's like we need it. Yeah, sure, it converts to energy like carbohydrates do as well. We can use them as an energy source, but they also serve other things which we've spoken about before, like maintaining the cell integrity of the cell membrane layer in our cells and obviously allowing us to absorb vitamins and doing things like reducing inflammation and those kind of things. So we do need to make sure that we have a composition of fats in the diet. It isn't all bad news when it comes to consuming fat. The next macronutrient is protein. Now, protein is really, really important. It's considered an essential nutrient, and that's because we can't really create proteins in the body. Your body can't create proteins. It needs to ingest proteins to make sure that we can fulfill the obligations that protein do in our body, like from maintaining immunity to turning over cells and repairing tissue from training sessions. Like we need to make sure we're getting an adequate amount of protein in the diet for that. And if we don't, our body actually essentially will break itself down to fulfill all these little obligations that it has because it doesn't have any supply coming in through the diet. Now, when we talk about proteins, they break down into amino acids. Now, there's 20 types of amino acids. When we break those amino acids up, we want to make sure that we're consuming at least the 9 essential amino acids, which means that we can break or use these 9 to make the other 11. So when we talk about these nine essential amino acids typically come in the form of like animal-based proteins. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't get them from plant products. So if your clients are vegetarian or vegan or something like that, they can still obtain these 9 essential amino acids, which do fulfill the 20 amino acids that break down from protein. They have to get a little bit more strategic with like where they get their protein from. So we just got to make sure that like, yeah, we know exactly like what those foods have in terms of like an amino acid source, and that that person's getting adequate amounts in the diet. Now, I spoke about it briefly before. Protein's really important. It's not just to get massive. It's to help repair tissue from training. It's there to help create or produce enzymes that are involved in the thousands and millions of chemical reactions in the body. It's also there to help create antibodies to help with our immunity as well. So even if we're not trying to actively put on muscle, which most people think is why we eat protein, every single person needs protein because we're made up of proteins. So it is really important to get our proteins, which typically come from food sources that are high in like meat, fish, eggs, dairy, and then we've got some plant-based products, which you'll have to do your homework on to make sure that you're getting a large or a decent amount of quantity in protein. You know, things like tofu are a really good source to go to. You can get some beans and legumes that do have an amount of protein that if you mix them together, you would get a sufficient supply and obviously a sufficient amino acid profile as well. So you've just got to make sure if your clients are having these discussions and some of them want to make that choice and go vegetarian, that they may need to go and seek some advice from someone like a nutritionist or a dietitian to ensure that they're getting adequate amounts of protein and other nutrients as well that we typically can just dot the I's and cross the T's on when we eat red meat. Like, it's just a really easy way to get a bolus serving of nutrients in. So this is where, like, if we know this stuff, we can now engage in this conversation and refer out to someone who's going to help that client in the best way possible whilst you guys help them in the gym. That's what this is all about. There's nothing wrong with referring out to a specialist in another space. It makes you look really good and actually really professional, and you're doing it with the client's best interest at hand. So if you want to be a good coach, you want to be a good business owner, you want to run a good, reputable, client-first personal training brand, it's like, make sure you're always making decisions with the client's interests at heart. That's all we're going to talk about today in terms of our introduction to nutrition as coaches and understanding macronutrients. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications on, because we will be dropping lots and lots of videos in the future. Make sure you guys navigate your way through the other content as well. There's tons of stuff, videos, business, technical skills, other business related stuff as well. Head to the website, give yourselves a business health check, go and do the business scorecard, see where your business is strong and see where there's some areas that might need a little bit work, just to kind of bring your focus in there. So you're not just working on your technical skills, but you're working on your business skills as well. All right, guys, we'll see you for the next video.